They were known as the Zarnathi, and to the rest of the galaxy, they were not a species, they were a verdict. Forged on a planet with gravity 4 times Earth's and atmospheric storms that flayed flesh from bone, they had evolved beyond what most civilizations could even comprehend. Their bones, laced with crystallized carbon, could snap steel. Their bodies self-repaired within hours. Their minds were linked by a low-frequency neural web that turned their armies into one consciousness. Individually terrifying. United, unstoppable. No galactic power had withstood them. Empires centuries old crumbled in hours when the Zarnathi arrived. There were no negotiations, only conquest. Surrender meant extinction. Resistance meant annihilation. Over the course of 600 standard years, they turned the Milky Way into a chessboard, and they were always 10 moves ahead. They didn't rule with politics or ideology. They ruled with certainty. You either obeyed or vanished. Entire species were edited out of history. The Valari, with their obsidian skin and plasma oceans, fell in 3 days. The crystalline ammonites, once thought invincible due to their impenetrable fortresses, collapsed in 1. The Zarnathi didn't just conquer, they erased, rewritten planetary systems like paragraphs they didn't like. No rebellion, no resistance, no remnant. They believed their supremacy was biological fact, not chance. Their historians referred to other species as variables. They were constants. In time, they stopped deploying full fleets. 1 ship was enough. 1 declaration, and worlds bowed. They believed no unknowns remained. Exploration was pointless. The universe had been measured, weighed, and owned. Theirs was a rule not based on fear alone, but inevitability. They didn't ask if something could be destroyed. They only asked how quickly. They had transcended threat. What they hadn't met, what they hadn't accounted for, was humanity. The first sign came as a garbled ping from a distant quadrant marked as barren in Zarnathi star charts. A signal anomaly. Weak. Artificial. Curious, but insignificant. Scout drones were dispatched without urgency. 1 entered the Sol system, analyzing planets like it had thousands before. It approached Earth, pinged its satellites, scanned its ships, recorded crude weaponry, erratic electromagnetic noise, and then went dark. A second drone followed. It returned damaged. Its outer hull was melted in multiple spots, data corrupted. Its last recorded visual showed something, staring back. 2 eyes. A face. Not fear, not worship, just defiance. That was new. That was impossible. The Zarnathi Command Council dismissed it as a malfunction. Another drone was sent, cloaked, armed faster. It approached the Earth and was instantly intercepted. Its encryption was broken. Its communications rerouted. It was hijacked mid-flight and reprogrammed to send 1 message back to its creators: "We do not kneel." This wasn't resistance. It was mockery. No species had ever dared. The first strategic analysis of humanity was written by Zarnathi logic Lord Corveth. It was only 3 words long: kill on sight. A full observation fleet was dispatched to orbit the Earth and begin tactical assessment. This time, something shifted. The calculations began to glitch. The AIs used to predict invasion timelines looped without result. Outcome branches multiplied exponentially. The human military network was uncoordinated, yet agile. Their weapons looked primitive, yet the damage ratios didn't add up. Ships moved chaotically. Energy signatures spiked unpredictably. Each human battle response defied all expectations. They had no pattern. No central command grid. Each pilot behaved as if they were fighting their last battle, and trying to win it at all costs. The Zarnathi had seen fanatics before. They had seen hopeless fighters. But never a species so committed to destruction, even if it meant their own. Suicide tactics weren't anomalies. They were doctrine. They dug deeper into the data and found chaos. Human history was a tapestry of blood, fire, and reinvention. They had destroyed themselves multiple times. Nuclear winters. Biological wars. Civilizations rising and collapsing, again and again. But every time, they came back stronger, stranger, more ruthless. They didn't evolve linearly. They leapt, skipped, and clawed their way into progress. They didn't adapt to their environment, they forced it to adapt to them. Swamps were drained. Deserts turned to farmland. Mountains tunneled through. Disease? Beaten. Extinction? Dodged. Predators? Tamed or eliminated. They had taken a death world and declared themselves its masters. What unsettled the Zarnathi most wasn't human power, it was their unpredictability. There was no model that held. In simulations, humans sacrificed entire continents to win skirmishes. In projections, their scientists developed technologies under pressure that should have taken centuries. They didn't break under stress, they accelerated. No other species had been this erratic. They didn't just survive catastrophe. They were birthed by it. Worse, their culture glorified war not as shame, but as identity. Soldiers were praised. Martyrs were legends. Children were raised on stories of battles, sacrifices, impossible odds defied. Humanity didn't fear extinction. It flirted with it, danced on the edge, and somehow always stepped back stronger. To the Zarnathi, this was insanity. But it was working. When asked to define humans, Zarnathi linguists failed to agree on a word. Some said plague. Others said storm. The term that eventually stuck came from a war tactician who had never lost a battle. He called them wildfire. Not because they were chaotic, but because they spread, and could not be reasoned with. The galactic order was never prepared for a species like this. A species that didn't care who ruled before, didn't fear superior force, didn't obey the rules. They didn't want to conquer. They wanted to survive, and anything that stood in the way of that was marked for elimination, no matter how strong. For the first time, the Zarnathi sent a full battle fleet without the intention of immediate conquest. They wanted to understand. But deep down, they knew something had changed. The numbers no longer favored them. The galaxy had always belonged to the strong. But now, the strong had met something else entirely. And the laws of history were about to be rewritten. The Zarnathi fleet entered the Sol system expecting another ceremonial victory. Their ships were cloaked, their weapons primed, and their SciComm networks buzzing with arrogance. Every prior campaign had followed a perfect formula: detect, dominate, delete. Humanity was supposed to be another unremarkable species awaiting classification and subjugation. But the moment their fleet crossed Neptune's orbit, the first anomaly hit. Navigation systems glitched. Communications echoed back with distorted laughter. Their encrypted command node was breached by what looked like an ancient Earth language protocol, Morse code. It blinked one word: run. Satellites on Earth had already tracked the Zarnathi months earlier. Instead of preparing to surrender or evacuate, humanity had gone dark. No broadcast. No diplomatic attempt. Just silence. The kind that precedes violence. The Zarnathi expected panic. Instead, they found absence. What they didn't realize was that humans weren't preparing to fight a war, they were preparing to teach one. From the Zarnathi perspective, human tactics were abominations. Military protocols ignored all known principles. Units were disorganized. No formation. No patterns. They improvised with raw instinct. Zarnathi AI categorized the behavior as statistical noise, unable to predict outcomes beyond a few minutes. On the battlefield, humans leveraged asymmetry. Rather than meeting force with force, they struck at weak points, retreated, reshaped, and re-engaged like smoke, impossible to grasp, impossible to escape. Captured footage showed humans repurposing industrial machinery into weapons within hours. Communication lines were made of scavenged tech. Some units spoke in deliberate code switches to confuse eavesdropping. Every human squad seemed to operate autonomously, as if each one had a different objective. This shattered the Zarnathi's doctrine, which relied on predictability and mirrored logic. Attempts at psychological profiling yielded more confusion. Human soldiers laughed before charging into hopeless battles. Some sang. Others painted symbols on their armor, personal, emotional, irrational acts the Zarnathi could not comprehend. Why waste time on ritual in war? Why not fear death? Their analysts couldn't answer. They only recorded the growing dread within their ranks. When a Zarnathi command vessel was boarded by what should have been an unarmed transport, the results were catastrophic. The vessel's interior cameras showed men and women in patched suits planting explosives, hacking terminals mid-firefight, and dragging wounded comrades while firing backward. One was heard yelling, "If I die, make it count." They all died. And yet, they won. The ship exploded 3 minutes later, taking half a fleet with it. The most staggering realization came from data intercepts of human media. Entire archives of their history were warfare, conflict, revolution, and defiance, not just against enemies, but against themselves. Civilizations rose and fell by their own hands. Empires destroyed by rebellion. Peace shattered by ideology. And every time, they came back stronger. Humans didn't just endure adversity, they multiplied through it. One analyst noted that human technological progress increased after every mass casualty event. Disasters birthed innovation. Trauma bred strength. The Zarnathi began to suspect that conflict wasn't an aberration in human culture, it was the engine. This idea was horrifying. Even worse was humanity's refusal to acknowledge their place. They didn't recognize the Zarnathi as apex predators. They didn't negotiate. They didn't worship. They called them invaders, monsters, parasites. The word used in one intercepted speech, tyrants. Another, obsolete. In interrogation, a captured human officer was asked what they would do if Earth fell. He responded, "Then we'll fight from the stars." When asked why they didn't surrender like all others, he said, "Because we're not done evolving." The words were transmitted to the Zarnathi War Council, where silence followed. None knew what it meant. That made it worse. The turning point came when a human virus infected one of the Zarnathi's AI-controlled battlegrids. It wasn't malicious software. It was music. A soldier had embedded a Beethoven symphony into a malware payload. For 3.6 minutes, an entire Zarnathi fleet's targeting systems froze while violins screamed through command nodes. Their ships stalled mid-battle. 12 were lost before systems recovered. No damage protocol accounted for a song. From that point, nothing aligned. Morale wavered. Predictions failed. Tactical meetings included phrases like "assume the illogical." Some Zarnathi commanders called it corruption. Others called it madness. A few called it genius. They watched more footage. Human troops rescuing enemies. Soldiers refusing orders. Individuals sacrificing themselves for no strategic gain. These weren't errors. They were patterns outside comprehension. The Zarnathi realized they were not dealing with another species. They were confronting a variable too dynamic for containment. A civilization with no upper limit. No ceiling. They didn't just adapt to threats, they became the threat. For a species built on control, this was terror incarnate. Diplomatic probes were sent under stealth to make contact, not from strength, but from fear. They were never acknowledged. One was intercepted and returned with a message scratched into its hull, "Try us." One Zarnathi historian wrote a private report later classified as heresy. It read, "They're not the strongest. Not yet. But they are the only ones who grow when threatened. They don't want war, but they remember every time they had to fight. Every scar makes them faster, smarter, more reckless. And if we push, they will not break, they will ignite." More troubling was the growing awareness that humanity's war effort was fragmented, decentralized. Earth was only the surface. Colonies had responded differently, independently. With innovations the homeworld hadn't even deployed. No central command, yet coordinated chaos. The Zarnathi had faced order. They had destroyed harmony. But they had never seen evolution under fire, happening in real time. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about containment. Not for Earth's sake. For the galaxy's. Because if humanity ever understood how powerful it truly was, it would not stop. The Zarnathi didn't fear defeat. They feared what came after. What grew from the ashes. What walked out of the wreckage grinning, bloodied, and asking what came next. They had named themselves kings of the stars. But now they were beginning to realize the stars had other plans. And they were human. The Zarnathi invasion began with calculated precision. They deployed a siege fleet large enough to collapse a solar system, confident Earth would fall in hours. Their lead vessels, equipped with atmosphere disruptors and gravity cannons, positioned over strategic points. Orders were issued in unison. Occupy, suppress, erase. It was protocol. But this time, the playbook failed. The first wave met empty skies. Earth's defense grid was silent. No resistance. No contact. It felt too easy. As they moved in, systems began failing. Guidance arrays malfunctioned. Scanners misread terrain. Zarnathi ships drifted off course. That's when the ambush began. Human vessels emerged from lunar shadows, not in formation, but in erratic swarms. Unregistered, mismatched, jury-rigged, and lethal. Civilian transports armed with railguns. Mining vessels using electromagnetic pulses to disable sensor arrays. Some charged directly into enemy ships, detonating at point-blank range. Human losses were immediate, but so were Zarnathi casualties. What should have been a massacre became chaos. Mars, previously believed captured, ignited with localized EMP bursts. Buried weapons activated from dormant colonies. Entire platoons vanished in seconds. The terrain itself had been turned into a trap. Tunnels collapsed on advancing troops. Atmospheric generators ruptured to create sudden storms. Human insurgents moved through dust and death like shadows, untraceable and unrelenting. Zarnathi warriors trained in symmetrical conflict, frontline strength, direct suppression. Against humans, none of it worked. Cities were evacuated in silence, not in fear but in purpose. Strategic flooding. Controlled demolitions. Bridges collapsed mid-march. Skyscrapers rigged with explosives buried entire command groups. Urban zones became death traps. The Zarnathi had superior strength. But humanity used everything else. Footage showed soldiers wearing outdated armor rushing into fire, carrying makeshift weapons, striking from above, below, inside walls. In one encounter, a single human disabled an armored Zarnathi squad using only magnetized scrap and a detonator. Their command net labeled it non-replicable. It happened again 3 hours later. Standard drone overwatch failed. Human jammers corrupted neural signals. AI assistants used misdirection algorithms to create false fleet movements. A Zarnathi battalion was rerouted to Antarctica, expecting a human base. They found nothing, just a crater filled with explosives. Entire regiments were eliminated without engagement. On the orbital front, humanity's improvisation was equally devastating. Captured Zarnathi tech was repurposed mid-battle. Human engineers boarded disabled vessels and reprogrammed them into battering rams. One Zarnathi capital ship was turned against its own fleet using nothing but reconfigured targeting arrays and a suicidal hacking team. Zarnathi morale began to crack. Not from defeat, but confusion. No prediction model worked. No plan survived contact. Human movements made no tactical sense until they succeeded. The enemy didn't play to win battles. They played to teach lessons. In one encounter, humans retreated through a scorched jungle, drawing Zarnathi troops into a narrow valley. The valley erupted. Not with explosives, but with sound, frequencies that disrupted Zarnathi neural links. The hive mind broke. Units turned feral. Some began attacking shadows. Others froze, paralyzed by phantom signals. Human snipers finished what technology started. Zarnathi commanders began disobeying protocols. They split formations, doubled scans, delayed attacks. Fear had infiltrated command. Officers questioned orders. Pilots hesitated. One fleet general was executed for refusing to pursue a human vessel that had lured 6 others to their destruction. Among the troops, the term Earthborn gained new meaning, not as a species, but as a classification of threat. To be Earthborn meant to be illogical, suicidal, and effective. It meant every loss was bait. Every victory, a trap. Some Zarnathi began seeing hallucinations. Others claimed they heard human voices in static. Psychological breakdowns rose. Humanity didn't match power with power. They dismantled it. Piece by piece. Strategy by strategy. They corrupted the very rules of warfare. One Zarnathi weapon master described humans as a virus with memory. Not only did they counter every tactic, they learned, adapted, and came back sharper. They expected humans to fight for Earth. But Earth was just the opening move. Human colonies across the system began launching counterassaults. Independent fleets converged. No central command, but shared momentum. One asteroid mining colony weaponized its entire orbit, turning itself into a kinetic missile launcher. Humans turned war into momentum. Each defeat fueled a smarter retaliation. Each death bought time. Each sacrifice became doctrine. They embraced pain not as tragedy, but as transaction. The Zarnathi couldn't understand it, because they had never needed to. On Jupiter's moons, humans detonated fuel reserves, causing orbital distortions that disrupted entire patrol formations. Saturn's rings were mined with stealth drones that carved through unsuspecting Zarnathi wings. Every environment, no matter how hostile, became part of the battlefield. Even space itself became weaponized. Command analytics showed a disturbing curve. Human performance didn't plateau, it escalated. Each engagement produced exponentially higher kill ratios. It wasn't evolution. It was acceleration. The Zarnathi War Council deemed it impossible. Their AI disagreed. Projections showed that within weeks, human tactics would reach levels the Zarnathi had no defense for. Captured human recordings showed no glory speeches. Just raw instructions, coded maps, personal notes to families. They weren't fighting to prove superiority. They were fighting because losing wasn't an option. The will to resist had no expiration. The Zarnathi had prepared for domination. What they found was defiance layered in innovation. By the third month, half their forward fleet was gone. Not in retreat, erased ***. They began reinforcing, consolidating. Plans shifted from conquest to containment. Tactical withdrawal orders were issued. One warlord famously said, "We came to end them. Now we pray they don't chase us." Victory had been assumed. Instead, the Zarnathi met an enemy that didn't want to rule, just to make sure no one else ever would again. This was no rebellion. This was recalibration. The galaxy had followed one rule for millennia: strength determines control. But humans weren't playing that game. They were writing a new one. One war, one kill, one impossible strategy at a time. The Zarnathi command structure had never fractured. Not once in their recorded history. For a species built on unity through psychic cohesion, dissent was not just failure, it was unthinkable. But after the Earth campaign reached its 6th month, cracks began to show. Tactical losses turned into strategic disasters. What began as a show of force had spiraled into a war of survival. The myth of invincibility was no longer protected by fact. It was now a fragile belief under constant attack. It began with the destruction of the dreadnought Veil of Godhood, the flagship of the Third Fleet. Its annihilation wasn't caused by another warship or orbital cannon. It was breached by a human strike team. 6 operatives. Minimal equipment. They bypassed security systems the Zarnathi believed impenetrable. They didn't try to escape. They reached the core and detonated a black hole fragment manually. The flagship, its escorts, and its command data were erased in seconds. The psychological damage eclipsed the material loss. The Zarnathi didn't just lose a ship. They lost belief in their own superiority. As reports flowed in, a new pattern emerged. Humans didn't just destroy Zarnathi units. They targeted the command chain, undermined cohesion, and crippled decision-making. Communication nodes were isolated with precision. Leaders were hunted with disturbing consistency. In previous wars, leadership was untouchable. Now, it was an open target. The Zarnathi felt hunted. Fear spread through the psychic network, contaminating shared consciousness. Once seamless commands became clouded with hesitation. Tactical missteps multiplied. Soldiers disconnected from the link began to perform better, free from the shared anxiety. What was once unity became a liability. The unthinkable happened. Battlefield nodes began to sever themselves from the hive intentionally. Independent behavior was considered heresy, but desperation made heretics. Humanity's tactics accelerated. Propaganda broadcasts hijacked Zarnathi screens, showing their own soldiers being overrun, not by elite warriors, but by engineers, miners, civilians with weapons made from industrial waste. Footage showed captured ships being retrofitted mid-combat, human crews welding panels and jamming Zarnathi control systems live. It wasn't just war, it was invention. The most devastating blow wasn't on a battlefield. It was philosophical. The Zarnathi had built their identity on the belief that strength justified domination. that their evolution made them rightful rulers. But humanity had no such belief, no guiding myth, no unifying doctrine, just motion. Just survival. The clarity of that horrified them. Humans fought because they refused to stop. No mandate. No prophecy. Just refusal. A captured Zarnathi high speaker was interrogated by humans. When asked why they had invaded, he said, "Because we believed you were unworthy of existence." His interrogator replied, "And now?" The speaker paused. "Now we know / you are existence. And we are the footnote." Rebellions ignited across the galaxy. Oppressed species saw the footage. They watched Earth's forces not just resist, but break gods. The idea spread like fire: if the humans could fight, why not us? Entire systems once silenced by Zarnathi fear began arming themselves. The Zarnathi had silenced civilizations for generations. In months, humans reawakened them. Internal fractures worsened. A fleet commander defected, turning his warships over to human forces. When asked why, he responded, "They are what we claim to be." Others followed. A dozen high-caste officers were executed by their own kind to prevent further collapse. Loyalty could no longer be assumed. Belief was crumbling. Some Zarnathi began wearing human weapons, copying tactics, even studying Earth languages. Not to mimic, but to adapt. They no longer saw humans as a threat to be crushed. They saw them as a standard to reach. The apex title had shifted. Human warships stopped attacking head-on. They targeted Zarnathi manufacturing lines, food supply routes, energy refineries. Logistics fell apart. Whole fleets drifted powerlessly in orbit. One Zarnathi planet went dark, disabled not by bombs, but by cascading software failures introduced through a virus in a captured maintenance bot. The bot had a name etched into its shell: Nadia, age 9. Terror had changed shape. It was no longer an overwhelming force. It was silence. Corruption. Precision. The Zarnathi, who once ruled through dominance, were now reacting. Planning. Hiding. The shift was complete. They were no longer the predators. They were the cornered. The High Council convened in secrecy, abandoning their throne world for an off-grid station. No public announcement was made. For the first time, they weren't leading, they were retreating. Surveillance showed Zarnathi ships flying in random patterns to avoid ambushes. Elite guard formations now trained with paranoid redundancy. Every corridor had 3 exit points. Every commander traveled with decoys. The psychological toll ran deeper than numbers. Their pride, once their strongest armor, was compromised. And in its place, fear had nested. Not of human weapons. Not of death. But of what would follow. Because humanity didn't just fight for survival. They fought for legacy. And that couldn't be killed. A final contingency plan was developed. Not to win, but to quarantine Earth. Seal them in. Cut off their expansion before the infection reached the galactic core. A containment line was deployed. Mines. Blockades. Patrol loops. But it was already too late. Humanity wasn't spreading through ships alone. Their code, ideas, and defiance were already replicating in species across thousands of light-years. Entire cultures rewrote their doctrines. Slaves named their children after Earth battles. Former enemies of humanity declared neutrality or alliance out of awe, not mercy. The containment failed before it was finished. The last Zarnathi report to their remaining forces was not a call to arms, it was a warning. The flame cannot be smothered. Prepare to vanish, or become something else. With that, communication ceased. The war wasn't over. But the era was. The age of obedience. Of order. Of predictable power. Humanity didn't destroy the Zarnathi in one blow. They fractured them. Corrupted the roots. Rewrote the future. The species that once ruled from instinct now begged for time. Time to understand what they had awakened. Time to unlearn what they thought was truth. In meeting humanity, the Zarnathi didn't just lose a war. They lost the right to define what power meant. The final Zarnathi assault never came. What remained of their once mighty fleets stayed hidden beyond the edge of charted space, crippled by fear and confusion. Their high command dissolved into fragmented councils, each arguing over survival, not conquest. The species that had ruled galaxies now struggled to preserve the myth of its own relevance. Humanity had not only won, they had broken the logic of supremacy. The war was over, not by treaty, but by transformation. Earth didn't claim dominion. It didn't raise flags or build monuments. It rebuilt, repaired, adapted. The surviving human fleets were no longer just military. They were mobile factories, floating embassies, databanks of war-learned innovation. The old nations of Earth found themselves irrelevant in the face of something new. Veterans returned home changed, not just by battle, but by perspective. They had seen the edge of annihilation, touched it, and stepped back stronger. The species had evolved not biologically, but culturally. Victory hadn't elevated them. It had sharpened them. Colonies once distant became unified, not through governance, but through shared history. Martian engineers developed ship cores based on salvaged Zarnathi fragments. Jovian outposts created synthetic minds capable of processing the chaos of human battle tactics. Mercury's orbital platforms experimented with gravitational warping, a concept once thought theoretical. The war hadn't drained human potential. It had accelerated it. And still, they moved outward. The galaxy watched as Terran ships, black-hulled, asymmetrical, scarred, appeared in sectors that had remained untouched for millennia. Some arrived to trade. Others to protect. A few came to observe. But all bore the same markings. Not emblems of empire but a language. One phrase, etched into hulls, into uniforms, into minds, never again. Alien civilizations, once subjugated or hidden, emerged and aligned. Not by human demand, but by inspiration. The Terran method had proven that no tyrant was unbreakable. That no species was destined to serve. And so began the wildfire era, an age where rebellion wasn't feared, but expected. Humans didn't lead a galactic government. They lit matches and stepped back. What replaced the Zarnathi order wasn't peace, it was momentum. Change became normal. Borders shifted daily. Technology raced forward, unstable, unchecked. Human thinkers dismantled decades of ethical guidelines in pursuit of new weaponry, new biology, new thought. AI constructs debated with alien philosophers. Entire species rewrote constitutions based on Terran resilience models. It was chaos, but it worked. For the Zarnathi remnants, exile became permanent. They carved out lifeless systems, avoiding every signal, every trace of human expansion. Their teachings reversed. Elders warned hatchlings not of strength, but of caution. Not of pride, but of limits. They no longer spoke of conquest. They taught about the humans. Not as monsters. Not as heroes. But as inevitability. Every once dominant species now tracked Earth's transmissions with reverence and anxiety. Every military doctrine contained a Terran clause. Every diplomatic channel maintained a direct, private line to Sol. Not because Earth demanded it, but because no one dared misinterpret silence from humanity again. And yet, Earth remained relatively quiet. No monuments. No conquests. No central fleet commanding space. Instead, humans scattered across systems like seeds, carried by curiosity and the need to prevent history from repeating. They didn't want thrones. They wanted guarantees. That what had happened once, what they had stopped, would never happen again. This deterrent wasn't written into law. It was written into memory. The galaxy had not been conquered by humans. It had been rewritten by their presence. Their war wasn't about domination. It was about rejection. Rejection of fate, of hierarchy, of inevitability. And once that message was clear, everything else collapsed. Time passed. Some tried to forget. But the scars remained. Ruined Zarnathi fleets drifted, untouched, as warnings. Former battlefields were converted into learning centers, visited by alien children who asked questions their ancestors had once been forbidden to ask. Who were the humans? What made them different? The answer was never the same. Some said adaptability. Others said madness. A few said love. Because in the end, what terrified the Zarnathi most wasn't humanity's strength. It was that humans fought for each other. Not for conquest. Not for legacy. But for the simple right to exist unchained. That kind of will couldn't be calculated. It couldn't be cloned. It couldn't be erased. And so, long after the war ended, the stories spread. Of battles against gods. Of humans breaking the ceiling of possibility. Of a species that didn't know how to stop. Across the stars, their name was spoken carefully, not in fear, but in respect. The strongest species had met them, challenged them, and learned too late what they truly were. Humanity hadn't changed the galaxy. They had unshackled it. And history would never forget who lit the match.